Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Violin Podcast. I am your host, Eric Mrugala. Joining me today is violinist and founder of the Violin Guild on Facebook. Please let me welcome Dr. Immanuel Abraham. Immanuel, thank you for agreeing to come on the Violin Podcast this week.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Eric. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Can you tell the audience where you're from and how you got started on the violin?
Sure. Well, I was born and bred in Chicago, from Chicago's inner city, and the violin came to me from, my desire to play came from watching. I grew up on Sesame Street, and Itzhak Perlman had been a guest on the show, and I was infatuated with the instrument. He made it look cool. He made it look easy. What's not to love? Fortunately, one of those was right. It's very cool. I started begging for violin lessons right away, but it wasn't really in the financial means of my family. We lived in a small apartment, and violins hadn't come up before. And uh, a few years down the line, my mother had seen an ad in the newspaper, and it was advertising a free violin lesson at the Merit School of Music. I was 14 years old, and I went to go get the free lesson. Merit had an instrument that I could borrow for that lesson, and I had the lesson, and the teacher took a liking to me, which I'm really grateful for. And she told me that after her normal classes, that I could come back and return, and she'd give me another lesson free of charge. And so I wasn't going to say no. I just absolutely loved the instrument immediately. And everything that I wanted to do immediately became violin related, just pretty much overnight. The high school I went to wasn't the greatest, and I had a lot of issues with being bullied at the school, and it wasn't the poke fun and jeering type. I was getting physically hurt a lot at school, to the point where I was terrified of going to school. And the Merit School of Music and the violin, and it was just a completely different culture. And the best part about it immediately was just that I felt safe. Everyone, was smiling. Everyone was on your side. And the whole aim of studying music was to produce something beautiful. And I had a voice, in music that I didn't really have anywhere else. I felt like I could be heard, and people actually spent time listening to my voice, my musical voice. So it immediately was extremely important to me, and it took everything. I went and I got my first violin from the Salvation Army in Chicago, and it had 3 strings, and it was stored in a pillowcase, and that was my first violin. And I brought it to the teacher, and I was helped with setting it up and getting it to work. And immediately in my first 2 months of playing, I got through 4.5 volumes of the Suzuki method. And I had never read music before, never touched an instrument before. It was just literally all day. And so after those couple of months, the teacher said, you've made outstanding progress. The Merit School of Music has a program that you can audition for, and it's a tuition-free program, the tuition-free conservatory. They have a symphony there, full symphony, music theory, chamber music. And if you audition into this program, the tuition is free. The rule had been that you needed to have been playing your instrument that you're auditioning on for at least 2 years. And I'd only been playing for 2 months. And the dean of the school came. My teacher talked to her. She came and auditioned me, and she said I was the first student in the conservatory program that had been playing less than 2 years. And it stayed like that. Everything that I wanted to do, that I was doing, was music related. I stopped playing video games around the time, if not exactly when I picked up the violin for the first time. That was the last video game I ever played. I skipped prom, skipped my own birthday parties, anything to get that extra minute of practice in was done. I was getting up at 4 in the morning to, pluck things out on my instrument. Again, I lived in an apartment, so it wasn't the most conductive for practice. But what I did do, when I went to school, the orchestra room, I did join the orchestra at my high school, and the orchestra room was another place where I felt safe. All the trouble that was going on at my school, which involved physical abuse, gangs, drugs, you name it, it was happening there. But the orchestra room was a place I could feel safe. No one was interested in the orchestra, and so it came to the point where the director, would give me the keys because I was always the first one in the orchestra room and the last one out. So he gave me the responsibility of unlocking and locking the room. And towards the end of the day, that left me with several hours alone with just me and the instrument. So I got a lot of practice in that time. I started learning how to read music. I was still musically illiterate, and I started reading my music forwards. I turn it on its side, and I read it backwards. I turn it upside down, read it from top to bottom, right to left. Anything I could do to develop and improve was something that I was going to do, and that was my start on the instrument. It just seemed that the more I practiced, the more good things happened. The first year of my playing, I went to Blue Lake Fine Arts Camp. People had come and auditioned students at the school. I left that summer and attended Blue Lake. And while I was there, I auditioned for their international orchestra, the International Youth Symphony Orchestra, and I got in, and I became concertmaster of that ensemble for several years in a row. And again, it was a merit-like situation where if you audition high enough, the program is paid for you. And in that orchestra, if you're concertmaster, they pay for the tour for you. And the tour at the time was just over four grand. And so that was basically the only way that was going to happen and keep happening. But I kept that position all 4 years, every summer during high school and my first year into college. And it was taking on serious repertoire. We were doing Strauss, Till Eulenspiegel. Um,
What a phenomenal piece, right?
oh yeah, it's great, and those were my first orchestra solos too. We did Tchaik 4, Tchaik 6, Mendelssohn's Elijah, um, Carmina Burana, tons and tons of repertoire with the ensemble. And at the same time, during the rest of the year, I had also auditioned into the Chicago Youth Symphony Orchestra. Um, Became a first violin there, and I still think that to this day I'd never worked harder for an audition. I
This was for the Chicago Youth Symphony.
Yes, yeah. I took I memorized everything that was on the audition list, forwards and backwards, and it literally got to the point where when the audition came, it was about 2.5 years after I started playing. It felt like reciting "Mary Had a Little Lamb." Like I had gone through it so many times. I'd literally memorized the measure numbers and the excerpts, everything about the pieces. So that was my start. I did other things and other programs. I played in the Oak Park Symphony, and I also did a tour with the Merit Symphony Orchestra. But all of a sudden, college was a possibility. People were talking to me about college for the first time, and that wasn't on the trajectory of my life.
At what age did you have that conversation where college was a possibility for you?
Sure. Well, my violin teacher, Guillaume Cambé, phenomenal violinist, and at the time he was concertmaster of the Chicago Civic Orchestra. And he asked me if he was complimenting me on the progress that I had made in a very limited amount of time, and he asked me if college auditions were within my intentions. I remember I just kind of looked at him like a deer in headlights because no one had asked me about college before, and I just thought, oh wow, that's a possibility now. And so I kind of stuttered my way through a yes. I knew I definitely never wanted to stop music. Music really, it saved my life. It gave me a place where I could, or many places where I could feel safe for the first time. And so for me, college just seemed like the way to continue playing violin and to get better at it and to continue having a teacher.
And I do want to talk about your collegiate years in a moment, but I just want to comment about your incredible story. This is for people who are listening. This is the first time I've talked to Dr. Abraham, and this I'm so glad that he's able to share his story and his experience with the world. And it's just an incredible thing to listen to coming out of the inner city of Chicago and kind of paving your own path out of the inner city where, it was very unfortunate to hear about all those terrible things that happened to you. But it sounded like that gave you that extra motivation to work harder, to wake up very early in the morning to continue pursuing your dream. Can you talk a little about, for someone who is struggling in kind of the same situation that you experienced, what it takes and goal setting and pursuing your dreams? Can you comment on that?
Sure, absolutely. I'm trying to find which one of those three to address first. But for goal setting, my I think the with goals, the most important and the most useful factor of goal setting is having those goals fit within a larger spectrum, a larger goal. And by that I mean, for example, I wanted to be heard. I felt like everything I said fell on deaf ears. I got, I had my nose broken. I had my black eye. I was stabbed with a knife, and much worse things happened to me while I was at high school. And every time I went to administration to talk about it, it felt like it fell on deaf ears. It was like I could stand anywhere and shout at the top of my lungs and no one would hear it. And I didn't know it at the time, but my goal was to be heard and to feel safe in doing so. Music was both of those. And so the getting up early, the going to bed late, the finding every corner I could possibly practice in. And I took my violin out at bus stops and just practiced there to get the extra 10 minutes in to figure something out. But the most motivating part of it was that it all fit within the bigger goals: feeling safe, being heard, and having a modus operandus by which to express myself, which I hadn't really done before. And picking up music was a way for me to also learn who I was. It's like I didn't know who I was. I hadn't heard myself talk and I hadn't let myself feel. Everything in my life was about not being vulnerable, and music suddenly was all about being vulnerable. And so everything fit within those goals and that growth. So I think, if I set a goal like, okay, get up early tomorrow because you might get more done, that wouldn't be enough by itself. Or, okay, practice 6 hours today because you'll be a better violinist tomorrow if you practice 6 hours today. That's not enough by itself. There needs to be, at least for me, in my own experience, an overarching goal, such as and something integral, such as safety or being heard, etc.
So, what you're suggesting essentially is to have very specific goals because one giant goal is sometimes unobtainable. And I know that I teach this to my students. And I know that you're an educator and you're a teacher, and I would love to dive into a conversation about teaching later on. But I always tell my students to, set at least three specific goals with a piece after every lesson. And I think that really does help, whether it's in music or even in life. I know that for myself, I have like a little journal where I write down the things that I want to get done for the next day. And there are a lot of very specific things, on my plate these days, but that's kind of keeping yourself accountable in many ways. And thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely, and that's spot on. A lot like driving cross country. Recently I drove from Arizona to Arkansas. What doesn't work is to get on the road and say I want to go to Arkansas. Like that's where you want to go, but that absolutely does not work.
That's the final
Um,
destination, right? But
right. It's a
what about the ins and outs of prepping for a road trip? Yeah.
Exactly. You've got the preparation. The preparation's super important, but also setting smaller goals on the way to that. You know, I, my saving grace during that drive was the welcome to Texas, welcome to Mississippi, welcome to Louisiana signs along the way. And so, I knew when those were coming. And so my smaller goals, my more specific ones would be the state signs. I'd get hungry. My goal would be, okay, get to, you know, the third gas station and then go to this restaurant. Smaller goals, and it's a lot easier to, take 80 smaller bites than to, have a whole foot long sub at once.
Yeah, I know that those are really difficult to eat on one time.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I want to talk about something very specific that you said in the beginning of the interview, where you said that the orchestra room in your high school was a safe space. And it sounded like to me, as you were describing it, it was almost like your sanctuary, where music was your sanctuary, where you can finally find some peace out of all the chaos that's happening around you. Can you talk about the music as a way to kind of escape from everyday life and kind of help you as a form of healing? Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. And this really touches strongly upon why I began to write music, and why composition became so important to me. And that reason is that music is, in every way that I know, a class of language. We humans read it, we write it, we speak it with something that produces sound, and we use it to communicate some part of the human experience. To my knowledge, those are all the factors of language. And I say class of language rather than a single language, like the musical language, because there are many genres.
I
Um,
was just going to say, I'm glad you made that distinction because oftentimes struggle with people saying music is a universal language. And it's a very common thing to say, but as you described, classical music is one class of language, and Eastern classical music is one class of language. So I think you're spot on that.
yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. Music is a universal language. It sounds great, and it also sounds epic. I don't want to be the guy that says that that's not true.
I mean, who doesn't
Uh,
want to say that? It is a pretty epic thing to say. Music is a universal language. It's very marketable, and but if you really dive deep and really analyze what those words mean, then there's something deeper going on.
Right. And with that particular statement, something that's just not true. And here, I say class of language rather than a single language because there's many genres. Many professional musicians even will debase a kind of music they don't like and say it's because they understand it on a level that its fans do not. I believe 9 times out of 10, the reason is the exact opposite. We don't like particular musics of the world because we do not understand them. For example, I can hear someone say the most beautiful words in Polish, and because I know nothing of Slavic languages, it will mean absolutely nothing to me.
Did you say that because I'm Polish? Or did you just randomly say that language?
Oh no, I did not know that you were Polish.
Well, yeah, I'm
Coincidence.
also from Chicago, so it's like it's like another Polish country in Chicago, so it's for all
True.
you Polish violinists out there. Yes.
But yeah, I could hear someone, and it might mean something to you if you heard someone say the most beautiful words ever in Polish, and it wouldn't mean anything to me because I literally wouldn't understand it. It's not that I don't like it; it's that I can't like it. In that way, verbal languages are no different from musical languages. There's some music that I do not like simply because I can't like it for sheer lack of my understanding. I don't understand death metal yet. Um,
And neither do I, and I think that's okay.
yeah, what professional linguist? You can have a doctorate in a language and not know every language on planet Earth. I think I'm not embarrassed to say that I don't understand X kind of music. And yeah, and that's why it was so and that's why music was so important to me, because it was a language, and it was a language that I could learn. And it's like, okay, well, no one will hear me speak English. I can say that I'm getting hurt, I can say that I'm hungry, I can say that this isn't working, and no one hears me. But I play music and people literally stop, look, and audiences come, and they come to hear you. That's a totally new experience and totally opposite. And I feel that I started old enough to really appreciate how significant that alone is. A lot of my peers, they were fortunate enough to start younger, but a lot of them don't remember not having an audience come to hear something. I remember not having audience. I remember when no one on planet Earth wanted to hear anything I had to say in any language. I remember not having an audience, and I remember not being able to read music. A lot of my friends can't remember not being able to read music. I remember hearing classical music and not liking it because I didn't understand it. I remember I was watching, I think I was watching Glory on the History Channel, and there was a scene in it where someone was playing a forte piano. It was something contrapuntal. I don't remember it very well, but I remember just thinking that that was the most terrible music on planet Earth. And I remember hearing my first violin concerto. I bought Pinchas Zuckerman playing the Tchaikovsky violin concerto, and I got that because it was a free. It came in a magazine, and it said you could pick it for free. And I heard that he was friends with Itzhak Perlman, the guy I'd seen on Sesame Street. So I got it, and I listened to the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto, and I remember being blown away by the technique, but I didn't understand the music. I didn't know what a theme was, and the rhythms were way more complex than anything I'd heard before. So I couldn't place a beat. I thought I knew what a beat was, and I didn't. And so I can remember not understanding the language of Western classical music either. So that gives me a lot of significance. That grants it a lot of significance because I can really really appreciate it for what it is. It wasn't always there.
Thank you, Dr. Abraham, for sharing all of that. And I kind of want to transition into your college days, your collegiate days. So you were able to, I'm sure that you took auditions, you applied for many schools around the country, and you got accepted into college. So talk about your collegiate years and how that experience was for you.
Sure, sure. my uh, my college audition process, that was one of the most nerve wracking things because I felt that college was a new goal for me, and it didn't feel like the end of the world if I didn't get into college for college's sake. What I was afraid of was that it would be the end of violin playing. The Merit School of Music the International Youth Symphony, the Chicago Youth Symphony. All of those ended at, when high school ends. After high school ends, you can't be part of those anymore, at least not as a student. And the looming thought for me was, if I don't get into college for music, the music ends. I mean, the development, I still needed lessons. I still needed training. I still needed help. I wanted to play music that I was starting to be able to understand. But if I was going to do that, I needed lessons to continue. So for me, the college audition process was, you need to get into college for music, or the music ends. And all those Paganini caprices that that you're listening to and getting goosebumps over, and your Last Rose's Summer Variations and whatnot, those will literally never happen if you don't get into college. So building up the courage to go about the auditions for the schools that I went for, because at that point, I'd been playing 4.5 years, and I auditioned for DePaul, Northwestern, the University of Michigan, um, a couple of other places. And I also felt nervous because my family was not well off. Driving to another state to go do anything was a big deal. And I don't even think we had a working car at that point. Um, and so, it involved the entire family. Everyone was pitching in, and I just felt like if I don't get into university, I'm literally going to let everyone down. Not just my family, but every teacher and ensemble that ever made me feel safe. It'll be a letdown for them. So I auditioned. I did get into every school that I auditioned for, and I chose the University of Michigan, and I'm very grateful that I did. I had a phenomenal teacher there, a couple of phenomenal teachers there, and I studied first with Andrew Jennings, Naumburg Award winner, and then I studied with David Halen for a few years. Really, really grateful for working with both of them. The Immediately after I got into university, um, unlike high school experiences where people took things not everyone didn't take everything super seriously. At the university, everything was serious. Your grades depended on everything. Your ability to stay in the school depended on doing well. Applying for scholarships the next year or getting a grant depended on doing well, and it was very competitive. When I got into Michigan, I'd say that year, probably 2009, was probably the cockiest I had ever been. I had reached this point where, I'd been playing 4.5 years. I was, starting to play Paganini caprices. I learned one. And I did number 14 for my undergrad auditions. And I just thought, man, if I can do this in 4 years, in 8 years, I'll be unstoppable. So I got into Michigan, and immediately I was one of the worst ones there. There's a whole new caliber of musicians. And it felt similar to the way it did when I first joined the conservatory at the Merit School of Music. It's like you quickly rise to the top of a program, and then you go somewhere else and you're immediately the worst one there. That's what happened at Michigan. And so I had that drive, just constantly playing catch up, and to stay in the school, to stay in the programs. And because I was so obsessed with it, and because that was the only thing, that's what mattered most, I was very, very pedantic about everything I learned. If I prepared for a test, I wasn't just cramming study the night before. I'd memorize whole sheets of information for the exam. I graduated from my undergrad magna cum laude, and then from grad school summa cum laude. And at the end of my undergrad, from the progress I had made and other work that I had done, I started composing near the end of my undergrad. And I also started working for the Sphinx organization out in Detroit. I taught for, by the end, I taught for six different schools in the Detroit Flint area. And I won an award and a medal, and they presented it to me at the graduation ceremony for undergrad. I became a first violin in the higher orchestra, and I saw myself catching up, and it was just exhilarating. I was playing the pieces that I was told all during high school that I would never play. I was playing Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto, and I went and I soloed it that summer. I soloed the Konus Concerto on radio. I did Sibelius somewhere else, but it was just getting more and more exciting. It's kind of like the energy about it was kind of like a dog. It's just like every minute is exciting. Even no matter how tired you are or how hungry you are or how many hours you've spent in that practice room, it's like the next second is still the most exciting second in the world.
Yeah, and if I may, it sounds like this success is almost addicting, right? The more you get that success, the more you want it, and it's an incredible feeling when you work so hard for so many years and then you have all these great things happening around you. I think that I think audience members oftentimes forget that there's so much work that goes into what you just described. And I think that is what's so rewarding about music is that it is clear to me just by listening to your story, it is a tool to save lives. And I know I work for a nonprofit organization that also serves, low income families in an El Sistema inspired program. And I know exactly what you're describing, what you're talking about, which is why I asked the question for what it actually takes to get to where you are today, having 3 degrees in violin performance. I remember I was given a presentation about a project I was going to do, and there was a gentleman in the audience who was like, "I didn't know there was a master's in violin performance," and I thought, and I think it, right? Let alone that people don't even know that there are doctorates in violin performance. So maybe this is the podcast where you find out. So there you go. And you mentioned a little bit about your compositions. You recently composed 24 caprices, am I right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, I did.
I would love for you to speak a little bit about that.
Sure, sure. Um, well, the caprices began largely because I was obsessed with learning everything completely. I put a lot of bow on the string hours in, but there are still basic things that I felt like my technique was ahead of everything else that I didn't know about classical music. Like I could tell you, I could play Paganini's 14th and ninth caprices before I could confidently tell you that Mozart was a classical era composer. And I was also still struggling to learn how to sight read fast enough. I was doing everything that I could to learn how to sight read faster, but those were issues. And so I spent a lot of time with my nose in the books to just learn everything I could. And composition came about because of a lot of things came together at one point. My teacher, Andrew Jennings, he encouraged all of his students to write their own cadenzas for their concerti, and I just written. I was doing Mozart 3 and 4 at the same time, largely because everyone knew them except me, and I needed to know them, and so I was doing those, and I wrote 6 cadenzas, one for each movement, for those concerti, and played them for studio. One of the students had asked, which which cadenza is that? I haven't heard that one. I really, really like that one. And that was like the highest compliment to me because I was very embarrassed about my cadenzas. I didn't even call them cadenzas. That's how embarrassed I was about them. And I was just embarrassed because I hadn't written anything before and hadn't played anything before. But then Jennings said, he said, Emmanuel wrote that. And then she asked for a copy, and I was like, "Whoa, "Oh, are you serious?" And so yeah, I got her a copy of it. And in the process of getting the copy, I made sure that all my I's were dotted and T's were crossed. Made sure all the bowings made sense. Just made sure everything was. I remember that was the night that I learned about engraving. I just stumbled upon the word. I looked it up. I read down the entire Wikipedia page, and I just spent the entire night up preparing these parts, basically just bowings and dots and whatnot. But I just wanted to make sure it was perfect. I got them to her. She asked what publisher I used, and I said, "Oh no, those are mine." She said, "Oh, that's really really neat." At the same time, I had started taking jazz studies, and my jazz courses were such that we had to write tutti lines, and then we'd give them to the professor. The professor would play them on the piano and basically comp, and we had to improv in front of the class. I was one of two students in the jazz class that had no experience with jazz whatsoever. And so I'll confess, I started that class off trying my hardest to memorize everything I could instead of improvising everything I could. And so I was writing things out. I tried to write things that sounded good, try to write things that sound jazzy. I'd look up, how to make this sound jazzy. What is jazzy? What does that mean?
Right. What does it mean for it to be jazzy? Maybe for anyone who's listening to the podcast, you can leave a comment and maybe describe it to us. What is jazzy?
Sure. What I was looking for was a kind of a recipe, for how to make jazz. And improvisation was completely new to me, and I didn't really have a concept of coming up with notes on the spot. And the difference is akin to, you can taste like pancakes, pre-made pancake mix. The recipe's exactly measured out, and if the person measures it out exactly, it tastes like, you can't tell my pancakes from the next person's pancakes if they follow the recipe exactly. And jazz is the feeling of not following. I mean, juxtaposed to Western classical, it's the feeling of not following a pre-made recipe. You're still making pancakes, but they're your pancakes, and you're making them with your recipe that you're making up every time that you do it. You just like you can taste that difference in pancakes, you can hear that difference in jazz. And eventually, it got to the point where people were saying that I was making good sounding tutti lines, and they were squinting their eyes and saying, "But it just sounds so robotic. He's not really getting it. It sounds just like the last time he did it." And I was like, "Oh, look, I spent 5 nights up in a row trying to write this out so that it would sound different. And I wrote stabs out on my hand so that I could glance at it before I had to play for you guys." But I was learning the recipe, I was learning how to write music. And I was also learning, I had this crash course in jazz also at the same time. And so, on top of the excitement that came from learning a musical language, I also had other musical languages coming to me simultaneously, and more people wanting to hear me in that language, even though I wasn't good at it. And that's when the idea of music as a language really became solid to me, when I actually put it in those terms and in those words. And the feeling that I get from performance versus composition is akin to, again, it's a language, so it's exactly like, not even akin to, poetry. I can read my favorite poem. Let's say it's "If" by Rudyard Kipling, or "Road Not Taken," Robert Frost. Your favorite poem. Sometimes I've recited just those two poems that I named right there. I've recited them, and it's brought me to tears because of the meaning that's in the poem. Just like a piece of pre-written music will. It's the experience isn't better, it's not worse, it's just entirely different when you've written the poem yourself. I saw, I forgot the name of the movie. It's a movie about where there's a wedding. I know there's tons of movies. the people were deciding, a couple was deciding whether to, or not to write their own vows. And it's very much like that. It's not better, it's not worse, but it's a very different experience.
Personal. It's very personal.
Very personal. It's your favorite bedtime story versus having a story that you make up, that you love, that says everything that you want it to say, or that you even need it to say. There's so many things that I feel are not said well in language, spoken language. And I ask for the forgiveness of anyone that hears me say this and, might have been an English major. But I do feel that verbal language is a poor means of communication. It's just the best one or most practical one that we have as a species. But there's so much that doesn't get said in language. How many times have you been hurt emotionally and tried your best to tell it to someone, and you could tell that they just didn't get it at all? I know I have like a life of that being the case. And I'd like to, for everything that my words don't say or can't say, I feel that music can or does. I was in an interview with PBS 8 or 9 months ago, and the interviewer had asked me if I were to write a line. He said, "What would the first line be in an autobiography about my life?" And I told him it would be a line of music. And I do feel that a line of music by me, from me, for me, would communicate more about how I feel, more about how I felt, and more about who I am at my core than one line of text is capable of doing. And that's where the composition came in. It was immediately a way not only for me to be heard in a totally different way than I'd been heard before, but I could be heard in that way and the other musical way at the same time. I was writing things and performing what I wrote, and the impact of that together was so strong. It was more meaningful than I have words to express. I need to write another line of music just to say what music feels like.
Thank you for sharing all of that, Dr. Abraham. I think what's unique is that I think we often look to the greats, like the Brahms and the Beethoven, and I think many of us artists are scared to compose because we're like, well, how do we live up to that? You know? So when we come back, we're going to talk about just that. So stay tuned. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for listening to this week's episode of the Violin Podcast with Dr. Abraham. I really appreciate anyone who's listening on any kind of podcast platform. And if you're not subscribed, please subscribe. And also check out our YouTube channel, our website, violinpodcast.com. Every week we have weekly deals, we have videos, tutorials, DIY. Recent couple videos are DIY, how to get the perfect bow hold for anyone who's a beginner or anyone who's interested in having a more solid, more relaxed bow hold. I encourage you to check that video out. Also, due to the COVID-19 crisis, we're also having many of us are experiencing online virtual lessons. So I also created another video, how to get the best audio from Zoom. All of that will be in the podcast description notes. So please make sure to check that out. We're back, Dr. Abraham. So now, before we transition into Facebook and the Violin Guild and how you started up that Facebook group, I want to kind of taper off our conversation before the break about composing your own music and performing your own music. Can you describe that feeling?
Sure, it's the feeling. Again, I just spoken about the all the things that we feel and all the things that we experience, that there are no words, no verbal words to actually say. All words are a close approximation, if at best, to the things that we actually want or mean or feel. The experience of performing something that I've written is it's like if you spend most of your life speaking other people's words and then you have an opportunity to speak your own. That's what it feels like. The feeling is it's freedom, um, it's expression, and that's when I feel the most known.
You mentioned earlier in the beginning of the interview that music gave you a voice. When you were into the orchestra and you were given this violin, this free violin from the Salvation Army, it was it was your new voice. So I think compositionally, these 24 caprices are tells your life story.
Oh yeah, I mean absolutely. It has there's several of them that I have not played in 5 or 6 years, and not because they aren't some of my favorites in them, but because the emotions that I was telling in them are so um, strong. They actually hurt emotionally to hear or look at again. So absolutely, I mean, my life story is in that. It's in my string quartets as well, and because I know exactly what every single note and dot and bowing choice and articulation in those pieces mean, the impact of hearing other people play them as well is very strong. I've heard uh, I've heard them performed by several dozen of my colleagues and former classmates, and the impact is just it's huge, and it's even odd in some ways. It's like if sometimes it feels like someone is telling a secret that only you knew. It's telling something deep about you, and then you see someone else do it on YouTube. It's like, how did they know I took cookies out of the cookie jar that day? So yeah, it's very vulnerable. I think would be the best word. Is the experience of having my work performed, and I think vulnerability is good and healthy for everyone. We're kind of in a culture, if I may say, where vulnerability is frowned upon for either reasons relating to toxic masculinity, or even just ego. Having a language that you can speak, and that is your language for being vulnerable, and as such being heard. That's one of the strongest things that a person can have. I can honestly say music has been a medicine for me in every way.
Great. Thank you for sharing all of that, Dr. Abraham. And I want to transition into social media because everyone listening to this podcast who knows you as the Violin Doctor. What a brilliant name. How did you come up with that name, the Violin Doctor? And how did you get started with the Violin Guild? As of right now, I think I checked maybe earlier today that the group has almost 35,000 members, string members. So anyone who plays a string instrument, beginner, intermediate, advanced, professional, they're all in this group. How did that idea come about, and share us your thoughts on that?
Sure, sure, absolutely. Well, my Instagram handle or the forum?
Yeah, let's talk about the handle, the Violin Doctor, because that's a pretty fun one.
Sure. Um, I well, I'm a Whovian, first of all, and a Whovian, for anyone who doesn't know, is someone who is a fan of the BBC classic Doctor Who. And so there's a lot of Instagram handles where someone shows the Doctor, the Dr period, the underscore Doctor, etc. And I wanted to be myself, but I always thought that that was a cool title for a superhero. It's like someone who is super, sort of like a number of the Marvel ones are. Like Tony Stark is super, not because he has a superpower, just because he worked his butt off. He's smart. He knows his stuff, and that's his superpower is literally just that he's smart. So aspiring to be like that, I chose the Violin Doctor, and I did not expect it to take off in the way that it did. So at first, I felt that it was kind of a corny name, naming yourself after a BBC hero to begin with, and then just putting violin in the middle of it, and it worked. It said everything that I needed it to say, and all my fellow Whovians got it immediately, and so that was where the Instagram handle came from, and it's just shy of 20,000 followers now. The Violin Guild, um, that came about from, well, I'd been, I'd frequented other violin forums. I mean, one of the ones I went to the most was Violinist.com. Um, Brilliant, brilliant website. Laurie Niles, she's the author of a couple of books that I also like to read on violin. I've read them more than once. But I would go to this forum and ask questions, and a few days later, there'd be a few answers to the question. And especially during my years in college, I felt that I just wanted the process to be faster, and I didn't know of any way to speed it up. And there were a couple of times when I had a question, and I would just make it a Facebook status, and the question would get a bunch of answers immediately, and I just thought, okay, that's a lot faster. What if and the answers that I valued the most were the ones that were from the violin players and the musicians, period. And I thought it would be cool to have a friends list that was all string players, and so I tried that. I tried making a separate Facebook account, and the only people the only people I would let on the friends list were string players. I just thought it would be awesome to be able to make a status and have it answered by just string players. And Facebook's TOS had changed, and they caught the duplicate profile. And also, like, I think most people who have a Facebook spend more time than is good on there. And so I managing two accounts at once was not the best use of my time as someone who wanted to practice a lot. So I was just trying to figure out a way that I could do this on one account, get string players all in one place, period. And then the group idea came up. And so I made the Violin Guild group. And I had been a member of other string groups before, but I just felt like they didn't have everything I needed and that I might be able to do a better job. String players, we all know each other, we all work together, we're in chamber groups together, we're facing each other in symphony. We face basically the same issues on different size instruments, and we transpose half of each other's repertoire for the other half. So I felt it would be great to have all of that in one place. One thing that had annoyed me about other forums was the lack of vetting. So you get string players and then an organist, a couple of tuba players, and a bunch of folks that don't play, and they're giving input where it's not useful. And for beginners who are asking questions, sometimes it's misguiding. There's some advices that an actual string player would never give. And there's other advices that someone who is actually a string player will always give. And there's some things that people didn't appreciate in the other forums. For example, someone who plays through Last Rose of Summer Variations or Paganini Caprice No. 4, in my opinion, it's the hardest one in the book, will post, and if it doesn't sound perfect, string players know to appreciate the work that did go into it at that learning point, especially if they're saying, I've been working on this for 6 months and this is where it's at. So I just wanted an exclusive community that vetted and had everything in it. So I made the Violin Guild. Immediately along was violinist Chloe Trevor, and she's the founder and director of Chloe Trevor Music Academy. It's a brilliant, brilliant academy for string players. Highly recommend anyone to take a look at it. And she joined and co-administered with me in the early days when we first started out. And I did a lot of work to build that forum because I saw people joining, and it was immediately what I wanted it to be. So I printed off hundreds of like color copy posters. um, I drove around to all of the nearby universities, Michigan State, Eastern Michigan University, Western Michigan University, University of Michigan, all the individual colleges in those universities, all the dorms. I just hung up these posters for this group everywhere. I did a lot of legwork for the first year and a half that the guild existed, and people started hearing about it. And then we started getting some real powerhouses to join. Rachel Barton joined, Mark O'Connor, Peter Wispelwey, Roman Kim. They were joining and they were just interacting with all of us. Like I could ask a question and have James Ines answer. And this was a resource like none other. You can try emailing half of those people and they won't get back to an email, but if it's on Facebook, in the Violin Guild, they actually get back to people at a high rate, and it became really invaluable. And the one thing that's really great about it is that it's structured to be unconditionally supportive. So someone posts their first violin video, they're not going to have, a dozen people laugh reacting to it and mixed results. We don't tolerate that. That's strictly against our rules. And you know, every post from everyone, you'll just see more and more support. And it's support from all levels. I mean, we've got tons of Grammy nominees, Emmy nominees, Pulitzer Prize winners, and they're all being supportive of each other. And I love that. I think that that's absolutely worth continuing. When I came into beginning my doctorate, it was invaluable. There were questions I wanted to ask, and they were poll questions. It wasn't the kind where I could just go to a forum and get 12 answers and that was enough. I needed, you know, two or 300 answers, and I could just do that through the guild. And it was tremendously helpful for my education. I learned something new from the forum every day. As its head administrator, I do read almost every single post that goes through there. And now in these times, I mean, I found out about your show through the Violin Guild.
Oh, did you really?
Yeah, I did. Especially now in through with the COVID-19 pandemic, we've gotten all kinds of people coming in, and people have met students off there. I get emails on a weekly basis from people thanking me for being able to meet their teacher, or being able to buy their case, or being able to get more students through the guild. And it brought about my ambassadorship with Southwest Strings. And I know you wanted me to mention my recent trip to ASTA 2020 in Orlando. And that was sponsored by Southwest Strings. And that was sponsored, and I was connected to Southwest Strings through the Violin Guild as well. They've really appreciated it, and we've really appreciated them.
Dr. Abraham, I'm going to ask one last question and then we're going to play a little bit of Violin Podcast Trivia. And since you did hear the last episode, I'll explain the rules one more time. But before we get to that, I just want to leave with one question for our audience here who's listening in today on the Violin Podcast. You said that you're an educator, that you're also a teacher, and it's clear to me that you, just by your very nature, you're always trying to bring a sense of community, especially in the Violin Guild and what you were speaking about today. Can you give anyone who's listening some advice on, they might be feeling stuck in the practice room during this COVID-19 pandemic, and everybody has a very different situation, different circumstances, and you obviously have a lot to say about the topic. What can you suggest to someone who is at home listening and is trying to get some inspiration or lacking inspiration, and are, trying to recreate that spark to continue on with music or just to play music?
Sure, absolutely. And I haven't been void of that challenge myself. Um, I think all of us have felt it. I talked about how it's very, it's great to have an audience. It's great to not just be heard or tolerated, but to actually want to be heard and have people who want to hear you. Is what I meant to say. When that's gone, our industry relies on our audiences, and we have our in-person audiences aren't around anymore, and that can be difficult to tolerate. This is the lowest number of performances that I've had since the day I started. What helps me to stay motivated is, I think, for most of us, especially those of us who play music as a career, or we are serious students, or we're in college for it. I would bet every last one of us has said, I wish I had some time to do this. I wish I had some time to learn that. This another concerto I only learned the first movement of. I really wish I had the time to learn the next two. If you have time on your hand, especially undesired time on your hand, this is an opportunity to turn that undesired time into that desired time. And a motivator for that can be, you've probably spent the last decade at least learning how rare that time comes by. Now it's here and it's forced upon you. Use it. This time is important. It's and time is valuable. I've gone back and forth trying to figure out which is more valuable, time or money. They're both pretty high up on that list. But one thing we never want to do is waste either of those things. And in order for time to keep its value, you have to put it to good use. And how exciting will it be to, 'cause when this ends, because it will end. But how exciting will it be to have it end and know that you have the mental fortitude to actually learn music still, to improve still. I think the best professionals, the best teachers, the best players, period, are the ones who are still students and who never stop being a student. A student is just someone who has the gumption and will to continue learning. And this is a period of time that we can use to learn. And I think that every motivation imaginable, if we allow ourselves to actually imagine them, is present.
I couldn't agree more. I think that for me, I think we often fall into the trap where we have too much time and then we're like, oh, well, the couch is right over there. I can, I can sit down and watch a piece of television or Netflix or, stream something. But I think you only have a finite amount of time in the day. And as we discussed earlier about organizing your time efficiently, everybody has different goals, everybody has different situations, of course, but it's about, you succeeding on your goals, not on somebody else's goals. And I think, we're all in this together. And I think just like the Violin Guild, I hope that this violin podcast community grows. And please leave comments and questions on on iTunes, on Spotify, on Google Play, wherever you listen to your podcast. Please leave the comments. I do read them and I do respond to them, and you know we love to hear from you. So thank you, Dr. Abraham, for sharing all of that. Now we have Violin Podcast Trivia. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this is Violin Podcast Trivia. I ask my guests to get 3 out of the 5 questions right in 25 seconds in order to get a prize from me. So I have 25 seconds on the clock. Here we go. 3, 2, 1, go. What town was Beethoven born in?
He was born in Bonn.
How long did it take for Tchaikovsky to write his violin concerto?
I want to say a year. He wrote it for his boyfriend.
Which opus number was Paganini Caprices?
Opus 1.
And time. And that is time. So we didn't make it all the way to the 5 questions, but I'll get, just for good sport, I will give you the last 2 questions. Who is considered the Stradivari of bows?
Francois Tort.
Yeah, you would have gotten that question right. And who is the current music director of the Boston Symphony?
I don't know.
And that would be Andries Nelsons. All right, but since you were able to just answer 3 questions, if you get these 3 questions right, you'll be eligible to win a Violin Podcast mug from me. All right. So, number 1, what town was Beethoven born in? You said Bonn, and Bonn was correct. So you got number 1 right. So number 2, how long did it take for Tchaikovsky to write his violin concerto? You said 1 year. As a matter of fact, it was 2 weeks he wrote it.
Wow.
He wrote it in 2 weeks because he was inspired by Lalo Concerto and then went back home and wrote it in 2 weeks. I think he wrote the second movement in a day, if I'm not mistaken.
He replaced the second movement. He turned his original second movement into an orchestral work, and then replaced it with another one, the canzonetta.
Beautiful movement, right?
But yeah, I think the canzonetta, I think he did right in a day.
Mm-hmm. And the third question was, which opus number was Paganini's Caprices? Opus 1. So you got 2 out of the 5 questions right. Unfortunately, you need to get 3 though. I'm so sorry.
I got how many out of 5 correct?
So you got the first one right, which was what town was Beethoven born in, which was Bonn. You got that right. And you said 1 year. How long did Tchaikovsky's violin concerto?
Right.
Like how long did the concerto was written? It was 2 weeks, which was written. You said 1 year. And then which opus number was Paganini's Caprices?
Opus 1.
1. You got that right. And if we had a little bit more time, you would have gotten Francois Tort right. So you would have gotten 3 out of 5 right. So you would have gotten the mug. But it's kind of a tricky game, yeah. 25 seconds on the clock. It's kind of quick, which makes this a whole lot of fun.
Oh, maybe next time. Oh well.
Next time, maybe we'll do a special YouTube video of Violin Podcast. Maybe you can redeem yourself. How does that sound? Maybe the reward will be bigger.
It sounds good to me.
All right. Well, Dr. Abraham, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on all things violin related, sharing your story in music and outside of music. And I wish you all the best. And I hope that people get to join the Violin Guild and follow Dr. Abraham on social media. He is his handle is the Violinist Dr, and he shows a lot of informative things on his social media platforms in terms of teaching, in terms of education, and wouldn't be a bad idea to follow him. So thanks again, Dr. Abraham.
Hey, thank you, Eric. Thanks for having me on. It's a real pleasure, and I always enjoy listening to your show. I appreciate everything that I learned from it, and until next time, thank you.
Until next time.